The Empress's Thread: How Asian Women Engineered the Silk World. Chapter 7: The Joseon Loom, Korea's Quiet Powerhouses. History often measures the power of an empire by the height of its fortress walls, the vastness of its conquering armies, or the glittering weight of its national treasury. Yet, if we look closely at the 5-century reign of the Joseon dynasty, the true financial and structural backbone of the kingdom was not forged on the battlefield, nor was it debated in the grand halls of the royal court. It was woven, thread by agonizing thread, in the quiet, secluded courtyards of traditional Korean homes. To understand the profound economic leverage wielded by the women of Joseon, we must first understand the ideological cage that sought to render them invisible, and how they transformed that very cage into an engine of national survival. When the Joseon dynasty was established in the late 14th century, its founders sought to completely restructure society. They moved away from the relatively permissive Buddhist traditions of the preceding Goryeo era and anchored the new state firmly in rigid Neo-Confucian philosophy. At the heart of this social engineering was a doctrine that demanded a strict segregation of the sexes, an ideology formalized in law as Niwobup, or the rule of inside and outside. Under this patriarchal mandate, the world was sharply and unforgivingly divided. The public sphere, the realm of politics, commerce, agriculture, and intellectual discourse, belonged exclusively to men. Women, meanwhile, were legally and culturally confined to the inner domestic courtyard, a highly restricted space known as the anbang or anki. The restrictions placed upon these women were absolute and severe. Society was ruled by the Yangban nobility, who constituted roughly 10% of the population, and their women were entirely hidden from the outer world. If a noblewoman absolutely had to travel, she was confined to a closed palanquin known as a gama. If she walked, she was forced to obscure her face and body with a heavy hood known as a changet, ensuring her features were never exposed to passers-by. Even women of the commoner Sangmin class, who had to labor in the agricultural fields alongside their male relatives, were bound by an oppressive social code. They were forced to don a shawl called a suj chima to hide their faces, and they were subjected to a lifetime of mandatory obedience, first to their fathers, then to their husbands, and eventually to their firstborn sons. For centuries, historians and outside observers viewed the anbang purely through this lens of subjugation. They painted the inner courtyard as a quiet domestic prison where women were isolated from the currents of history, politics, and power. It is easy to look at the architectural separation of the sexes, the heavy veils, and the legal disenfranchisement, and conclude that the women of Joseon were entirely powerless. But this is where we must entirely flip the historical narrative. The Neo-Confucian architects of Joseon society made a profound, inadvertent miscalculation. By restricting women to the home and categorizing textile production as a fundamental domestic duty, they inadvertently turned the inner quarters of every Korean household into a highly efficient, decentralized, and self-sustaining textile factory. These women were not merely passing the time with idle embroidery. They were operating heavy industrial machinery. They were cultivating, processing, and engineering complex natural fibers. Because woven cloth functioned not only as protective wear, but as the primary currency and the mandatory tax payment to the state, the women operating the looms in the shadows of the anki were literally weaving the financial backbone of the entire kingdom. Far from being a passive domestic retreat, the anbang was a loud, rhythmic, and intensely demanding industrial zone. The women of Joseon were the silent engineers of a vast economic network. Their hands were stained with plant dye, their lungs were filled with floating cotton dust, and their bodies were synchronized to the relentless, percussive clatter of the heavy wooden loom. They were Korea's quiet powerhouses, and without their daily, exhausting labor, the Joseon state would have faced immediate economic collapse. The architecture of industry. To truly grasp the scale of this domestic industry, we must examine the physical space in which these women lived and labored. The traditional Korean home, known as the hanok, is rightfully celebrated today for its serene aesthetic and its brilliant environmental engineering. Built from exposed timber, stone, and clay, the hanok was designed according to the ancient principle of bisanimsu, seeking perfect harmony with the surrounding topography by placing a mountain to the back of the house and a river to the front. Yet, beyond its philosophical harmony with nature, The hanok was structurally adapted to accommodate a massive, unforgiving piece of industrial equipment, the traditional Korean loom or baeoptul. The architectural layout of the hanok was physically bifurcated to reflect the rigid social order. The men occupied the saringki, the outer rooms designed for study and receiving guests, while the women resided in the anki, the inner quarters separated by low walls or fences. In the homes of commoners, the layout was more compact, often U-shaped, L-shaped, or square depending on the severity of the regional winters. The square layout was highly preferred in the freezing northern regions of the peninsula, as the enclosed courtyard helped retain precious heat. In the humid south, the L-shaped or straight-lined layouts allowed for maximum cross-ventilation. But regardless of the shape, the central organizing principle of the inner courtyard remained exactly the same. Function absolutely superseded aesthetic. The anki had to function as a staging ground for agricultural processing, food preservation, and, most importantly, massive, non-stop textile production. The loom was not a delicate piece of parlor furniture that could be easily tucked away in a corner when guests arrived. The traditional warp-weighted loom and its semi-automatic hand-loom descendants were heavy, imposing structures built of thick, solid timber. They utilized high-tension rods, hanging earthen weights, heavy foot treadles, and long wooden beams to stretch and separate thousands of individual warp threads. The sheer physical footprint of the weaving equipment dictated the spatial grammar of the home. The architecture had to wrap around the machine. Furthermore, the environment within the hanok had to be carefully managed to support the complex chemistry of fiber engineering. The hanok featured two brilliant passive climate control systems that made year-round weaving possible, the maru and the andal. The maru was a raised wooden floor that connected the rooms and the courtyard. This raised floor allowed air to flow freely beneath it, blocking moisture from the soil and providing crucial ventilation during Korea's suffocatingly humid, monsoon-drenched summers. This airflow was absolutely essential for drying freshly dyed yarns and preventing aggressive mold from consuming harvested bast fibers. Conversely, the andal was a sophisticated radiant underfloor heating system where intense heat from wood smoke in the kitchen furnace was channeled through a network of flues beneath a thick masonry floor. The introduction and widespread adoption of the andal system drastically altered the living culture of the Joseon dynasty. It eliminated the need for heavy, decorative floor carpets and allowed the inhabitants to sit directly on the warm, oil-papered floor during the brutal, freezing winters. This architectural innovation was vital for the weavers. The radiant heat of the andal kept their hands nimble, their joints warm, and their muscles loose, allowing textile production to continue uninterrupted through the darkest, coldest months of the year. The wide eaves of the roof protected the fragile threads from direct sunlight, while the paper-lined sliding doors, made of traditional changhoji, softly diffused the natural light, illuminating the intricate patterns of the loom without blinding the weaver. The architecture of the hanok and the engineering of the loom existed in a perfect, symbiotic relationship. The house was a machine for living, certainly, but for the women of Joseon, it was primarily a highly calibrated factory built to sustain the relentless demands of the loom. A symphony of bone and timber. Weaving is so often romanticized in popular culture as a gentle, quiet, and meditative art. But operating a traditional Joseon loom was an act of intense, full-body physical engineering. The traditional Korean loom required the weaver to become a biological extension of the machine itself, seamlessly merging human bone and muscle with timber and tension. Consider the raw mechanics of the handloom. The foundational principle of all weaving is to hold the longitudinal threads, known as the warp, under immense, uniform tension. The weaver must then separate these threads to create a horizontal opening known as a shed, through which the crossing thread, known as the weft, is passed. To achieve this rapidly, the Joseon weaver utilized a complex system of heddles. These heddles were thousands of individual wire or string loops that encased each specific warp thread. These loops were connected to foot treadles via a series of mechanical pulleys. By pressing down hard on the wooden treadles with her feet, the weaver mechanically forced half of the tightly stretched warp threads upward and the other half downward, instantly creating the shed. Through this narrow opening, she would violently throw the shuttle. The shuttle was a smooth, heavy wooden vessel containing the spool of weft yarn, and the weaver had to catch it flawlessly on the other side of the loom in a fraction of a second. But the simple insertion of the thread was not enough to create durable cloth. The true physical toll of the loom came from the battening process. Using a heavy wooden sword beater, or a suspended frame called a reed, the weaver had to forcefully slam the newly inserted weft thread tightly against the previously woven cloth. This immense pressure ensured the fabric was compact, windproof, and structurally sound. This entire process required a grueling, hypnotic syncopation. Press the heavy foot treadle, throw the wooden shuttle, catch the shuttle, slam the heavy beater forward, release, switch the foot pedal, and repeat. The weaver performed this exact sequence of mechanical actions thousands upon thousands of times to produce a single, standardized roll of cloth. The physical demands placed on the female body were extreme. Women spent hours strapped into backstrap configurations, using the dead weight of their own leaning torsos to maintain the high tension of the warp threads. Their shoulders ached constantly from the repetitive swinging of the heavy wooden beater. Their lower backs burned from maintaining the rigid, upright posture required for proper fabric tension, and their feet grew thick with calluses from slamming the wooden treadles. The loom was a relentless, unforgiving master. Yet, the women who operated these machines achieved a level of technical perfection that rivals modern industrial manufacturing. They calibrated the tension of thousands of fragile threads by pure touch. They adjusted the heavy earthen weights of the warp-weighted loom to change the drape and density of the fabric based on the humidity in the air. The semi-automatic looms of the late Joseon era even allowed highly skilled weavers to operate two distinct loom mechanisms simultaneously, doubling their output through sheer coordination. These women were not merely domestic laborers. They were highly skilled mechanical engineers, intimately familiar with the physics of friction, tension, humidity, and structural integrity. Mastering the fiber blend, the agony and art of material engineering. While the mechanics of the loom were universally demanding, the true genius of the Joseon women lay in their absolute mastery of agricultural and materials engineering. The Korean peninsula is a land of climatic extremes. It experiences dramatic, punishing seasonal shifts, ranging from sweltering, monsoon-drenched summers to bitter, Siberian-influenced winters where the winds cut like knives. To survive, the women of Joseon had to engineer a diverse portfolio of textiles, expertly cultivating and processing the four foundational fibers of the era: silk, cotton, hemp, and ramie. Of all these materials, the production of Hansen mosi, or fine ramie, stands as one of the most agonizing and highly engineered textile processes in human history. Ramie is a bast fiber extracted from the stalk of a flowering nettle plant native to Eastern Asia. It produces a fabric that is highly breathable, beautifully luminous, and incredibly strong, actually surpassing even cotton in its tensile strength. For the elite Yangban nobility, garments woven from Hansen ramie were the ultimate summer luxury. They prized it for a delicate, translucent quality that was famously and poetically compared to the delicate wings of a cicada. But the process of transforming the tough, woody stalk of the nettle plant into a microscopic, translucent thread required immense physical suffering and staggering dedication. The raw ramie fibers are heavily sheathed in a thick, stubborn layer of natural gum and resin. After harvesting the tall green shoots from the fertile, sea-swept lands of the Hansen region, the women used specialized ramie knives to peel away the thick outer skin. Once the fibers were sun-dried, turning from vibrant green to a dull brown, the women had to split the raw material into incredibly thin, uniform strands. To achieve the necessary microscopic thinness, the women of Hansen used their own bodies as the primary processing tool. They would place the raw, abrasive plant fibers between their front teeth and forcefully pull the strands through their tightly clenched jaws. This lancing process was a time-consuming, highly abrasive, and deeply painful practice. The constant friction of the raw nettle fibers sliced into their lips and gums, routinely drawing blood and leaving the master weavers with permanently calloused lips and severely worn-down teeth. Once the fibers were painstakingly split by the mouth and spun into yarn, the delicate threads had to be strengthened to survive the high-tension environment of the loom. The weavers would stretch the yarn over a slow-burning coal fire, carefully brushing it with a specialized starch to create a protective, hardened coating. The actual weaving of the reimi presented another extreme environmental challenge. Reimi threads are highly susceptible to minute changes in humidity. If the air becomes too dry, or if a sudden, unpredictable breeze enters the room, the brittle starched threads will instantly snap under the immense tension of the heavy wooden loom. Therefore, even during the most suffocating, sweltering days of the Korean summer, the women were forced to seal themselves inside unventilated, windowless rooms to weave the reimi cloth. They endured profound dehydration, sweating profusely in the stagnant air, all to engineer a fabric designed specifically to keep the nobility cool and comfortable outside. If reimi was the textile of summer luxury, hemp, known as samb, was the coarse, durable fiber of the working class and the dead. Cultivated masterfully by women in regions like Andong, hemp cloth was thick, rough, and primarily used for the everyday summer wear of farmers who required heavy-duty garments that would not tear in the fields. Because of its incredibly coarse texture, hemp was also the mandatory fabric for funeral wear and mourning garments. Deeply rooted in Neo-Confucian ancestral rites, the wearing of rough, scratchy hemp during a prolonged mourning period was a physical manifestation of a child's profound grief and guilt. The uncomfortable fabric served as a constant tactile reminder of the loss of a parent, a symbolic punishment for the child having outlived their elders. The women who harvested the tall hemp stalks, dried them, and processed the tough bast fibers ensured that the spiritual and practical needs of the entire village were consistently met. Silk, of course, remained the pinnacle of luxury, its production heavily promoted by the state. Queens of the Joseon dynasty would even host an annual royal sericulture ceremony within the palace grounds, personally demonstrating the picking of mulberry leaves and the weaving of silk to encourage female labor across the nation. Meanwhile, the introduction of cotton seeds from China in the late Goryeo period sparked a massive agricultural shift. Women quickly adopted new technologies like hand-cranked wooden gins to remove the sticky cotton seeds, and spinning wheels to rapidly produce durable, breathable yarn. But the true mastery of the Joseon women shone brightest when they combined these distinct elements. They were early pioneers in creating sophisticated mixed fiber blends, known historically as jiojik. They engineered complex, high-performance fabrics by crossing threads of entirely different biological origins. They created brilliant blends of raw silk and cotton, known as sanda, marrying the luxurious, shimmering drape and high tensile strength of protein-based silk with the superior breathability, moisture absorption, and durability of cellulose-based cotton. They wove translucent reimi with sturdy hemp, known as geoma, creating hybrid materials engineered specifically to balance texture, durability, and production cost. These women understood the mechanical properties of fibers on a molecular level long before modern textile science had a name for it. When the freezing winds of winter finally swept down from Manchuria, the textile engineering shifted entirely from breathability to thermal preservation. Without the luxury of modern synthetic insulation, the women of Joseon perfected the art of nubai, a highly sophisticated form of traditional quilting. This was not the decorative, patchwork quilting seen in Western traditions. This was a method of dense, functional, and life-saving structural engineering. To protect their families from the bitter cold, the women would sandwich thick layers of cotton batting between 2 layers of woven cloth. For items requiring extreme durability and moisture resistance, like pouches for flint or tobacco, they practiced siksilmanyang nubai. Instead of cotton, they would insert long, tightly twisted cords of hanji, traditional Korean mulberry paper, between the layers of fabric. They would then stitch the layers together with incredibly fine, continuous, and perfectly parallel lines. These quilted channels were often spaced less than a single centimeter apart, with the gaps between individual stitches measuring a microscopic 1.5 millimeters. This dense microstitching locked the insulating cotton or paper firmly in place, preventing the material from shifting or bunching. The resulting fabric was highly durable, completely windproof, and trapped body heat perfectly against the skin. Through the relentless, eye-straining mastery of nubai, the women of the inner courtyard engineered the survival garments that allowed their families to endure winter temperatures that routinely dropped far below freezing. The unseen economic engine, weaving the state. The true magnitude of the Joseon women's labor, however, extends far beyond domestic survival or the mastery of complex agricultural engineering. To understand the ultimate historical significance of the Joseon loom, we must zoom out from the Anbang and look at the macroeconomics of the kingdom. In the Joseon dynasty, the cloth produced in the quiet of the courtyard was not merely material for clothing. It was the foundational currency, the medium of exchange, and the primary mechanism of state taxation. While rice was highly valued and functioned as a standard of wealth, it was heavy, difficult to transport over mountainous terrain, and highly prone to rot and ruin. Standardized bolts of woven cotton and hemp, however, were lightweight, durable, easily transported, and universally demanded. Cloth was used to purchase daily goods in the local markets, to pay for tracts of land, and to settle debts. But most crucially, cloth was the hard currency required by the state. The Joseon government operated on a vast system of tribute and taxation that demanded specific, unyielding quotas of woven cloth from its citizens. The most crushing and consequential of these mandates was the gunpo, or the military service tax. Under the laws of the dynasty, commoner men were obligated to provide military service to the state. However, this physical service could be, and almost universally was, commuted into a tax payment of standardized rolls of high-quality cloth. The state relied entirely on this military cloth tax to fund the national army, to secure the northern borders along the Yalu River against violent Jurchen and Manchu incursions, to pay the salaries of government bureaucrats, and to facilitate massive international trade with the Ming and Qing dynasties of China. The military cloth tax was the financial lifeblood of the Joseon government. Here lies the ultimate, staggering paradox of the Joseon economy. The military tax was levied exclusively on adult males, based on a patriarchal household registry system known as the hojak. Yet the men did not weave. It was the women, confined to the inner courtyards, legally barred from public life, forbidden from inheriting property, and written out of the official tax registries as independent entities, who actually produced the currency that paid the tax. The economic pressure placed upon these women was unimaginably brutal. The central government in Seoul would assign fixed, inflexible quotas of military cloth to local magistrates governing the provinces. These magistrates, desperate to meet their quotas and often thoroughly corrupt, would mercilessly squeeze the peasant households. When the population of eligible men in a village dropped due to famine, war, or disease, the magistrates simply falsified the registers. They would demand cloth taxes for deceased grandfathers, or levy the heavy tax on newborn male infants. Furthermore, local officials frequently accepted bribes to grant upper-class exemptions to wealthy commoners, shifting the entire tax burden onto the poorest households. To cover the constant shortfall and satisfy the endless demands of the state, the women of the household had no choice but to weave faster, longer, and deeper into the night. If a household could not produce enough cloth to pay the gunpo, the consequences were violent and devastating. Men would be brutally beaten by local officials, agricultural lands would be confiscated, and entire families would be forced into slavery or driven into the mountains to starve as landless fugitives. The survival of the family, therefore, did not rest on the man's labor in the fields. It rested entirely on the speed, the stamina, and the technical skill of the woman sitting at the loom. Every single day, from the moment the sun crested the mountains until the last embers of the oil lamp burned out in the deep, freezing darkness of the night, the women spun, dyed, and wove. They processed the raw cotton, removed the seeds, spun the fibers into tight, uniform yarn, and operated the heavy wooden beaters of the bayaptul until their muscles trembled with utter exhaustion. They wove not just to clothe their children, but to literally buy their husbands and sons lives from the violent, coercive machinery of the state. Through their relentless, uncompensated labor, the women of the Anbang effectively financed the entire administrative and military apparatus of the Joseon kingdom. The grand royal palaces of Seoul, the heavily armed garrisons defending the frontier, the glittering diplomatic missions sent to the Emperor of China, all of it was underwritten by the calloused hands, the aching backs, and the bleeding lips of the women sitting in the shadows of the inner courtyards. They were the central bank of the Joseon dynasty, operating a vast, decentralized network of textile factories that pumped vital economic lifeblood through the veins of the nation.